So, in our discussion of reason and imagination, we took the example of mountains and hills, and we saw how mountains or hills, we look for its scientific phenomena behind their occurrence. We saw how these mountains and hills occur, and this was within the context of reason and imagination. Now, it so happens the case is that Shelley has also written an ode on one of the oldest valleys in France, that is called Chamonix Valley. It's one of the highest mountain peak, and the name of that mountain peak was Mont Blanc, and this was situated on the Alpine landscape. And Shelley composed this poem on this highest mountain peak, Mont Blanc, in 1816 when he was touring Europe with Mary Shelley. So Shelley imagined the Alpine landscape as some sort of powerful mystery of nature, something which is destructive and awe-inspiring, and this was very much antithesis to what Wordsworth saw. Wordsworth saw nature as a gentle being, as something which is soothing and benevolent, and he saw different elements of nature as destructive, as having the power of destroying ultimately the humankind. And if we particularly talk about his poem Mont Blanc, then if I take an excerpt from this Mont Blanc, power dwells apart in its tranquility, remote, serene, and inaccessible, and this the naked continents of earth, on which I gaze, even these primeval mountains, teach the adversity of mind. Teach the adverting mind. The glaciers creep like snakes that watch their prey far from their fountains. So it's quite beautiful that he imagined, again, this is a part of imagination, he imagined that the powerful force of nature that's there in the Alpine landscape, it has its power only in relation to the human mind. And although this was quite an intellectually challenging, intellectually rigorous poem, and it also had the element of philosophy into it, that is the ability of mind, the ability of perception. And he finally concludes that the power of this mountain, of the Alpine landscape of Mont Blanc, this has both the power of creation and destruction, which is something very much parallel to the power of imagination. So this is how he imagines the nature objects. And although he never confirmed to how Wordsworth saw nature or the objects of nature, because for Wordsworth, nature was very soothing, but for this man, it carried the quality of destructiveness to it. And please remember that he was a romantic atheist. So he can never believe probably in the spiritual powers that nature can give rise to. And on the other hand, being a romantic atheist, he was also a realist who would pursue or who would put the power of mind over anything else. And that's how here in this particular poem we saw that this powerful nature of force was being contrasted, was being questioned, was being challenged ultimately with the power of imagination. And it was seen as having a kind of parallel run to the power of imagination, to the power of mind. But although he was giving some antithetical point of view in his regard to nature, but he definitely conformed to how Wordsworth has described his poetic theory, that is those powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Yes, Shelley conformed to this same poetic theory. And if I quote when he saw this particular landscape, this valley of Chamonix Valley, a mountain peak called Mont Blanc, what he thought initially, and I'd like to quote here. He says about Mont Blanc that the immensity of these aerial summits excited when they suddenly burst upon the sight a sentiment of ecstatic wonder not unallied to madness. The immensity of these aerial summits excited when they suddenly burst upon the sight a sentiment of ecstatic wonder not unallied to madness. So what Wordsworth has mentioned earlier about the poet's hypersensitivity to these objects of nature, that very much rightly applies to, and Shelley somewhere confirms to the same poetic statement as well, but he moves a bit ahead in terms of his description and defense of poetry. Why? Because he says that we are ultimately the makers of the civilization. And who all are the makers? The makers may include the architecture. The makers may include lawyers, the maker may include the civil servants, the makers may include many other groups of people from different professions, from different discipline, which ultimately this man Shelley, in his defense of poetry, will harmoniously bring together and describe how they are also these disparate, these different, these varying professions and disciplines. They are also the part of the thing called poetry. Now let's get back to the reading of the text. Now, in the previous lecture, we started off with how he described poetry was defined as an expression of imagination, and that poetry is connate with the origin of man. When the human civilization emerged, poetry emerged right during those times as well, and it was running parallel to the human civilization's progress. And then in the same paragraph, he goes on to describe how this human civilization emerged, how men, when in its very infancy, in its beginning itself, the society, the human society, they started observing a certain order, a certain harmony in the objects and impressions that they viewed. That is, they're talking of right at the time when Iron Age or Bronze Age existed. And he says that even during in those times, human beings, or especially just generally speaking, man was able to observe some sort of order, and that's how different discoveries and explorations emerged. And language particularly, and I've discussed it many times in class, that language is in itself an arbitrary system wherein the words are nothing but a kind of symbols and codes which do not have any inherent meaning of its own. It is the human, it is in which context, especially in which it is spoken, it is the human beings which have consensuously decided upon the meanings by giving these symbols certain meanings, and that's how the language emerged. That's how various words and actions and there's objects and impressions, and what to call these words and impressions and these objects and impressions, that's how it emerged. So the expression part of language, it entirely depended upon in which particular social context it took place, in which particular group it proceeded from, in which particular civilization it emerged from. In the next paragraph, he describes about how this evolving of human civilization, where across different continents and the different civilizations that emerge in these continents, the men would dance and sing and imitate the natural objects in order to entertain themselves. So this element of pleasure was certainly the part of these various civilizations. And how would they entertain themselves? How would they seek pleasure? Through mimesis. If you remember, we discussed this concept of mimesis in Aristotle's Poetics, Aristotle's text, Poetics. And by mimetic representation, he meant how men would seek to entertain himself by the way of dancing, singing, reciting certain songs on poetry or ballet or other folk narrations. And even in these imitations, he would entertain himself with following certain kind of rhythm, following certain kind of symmetry, or a kind of order and uniformity would exist in these compositions. And obviously, this standard or this symmetry, this standardization or this symmetry, this uniformity exists in various other art forms as well. So a particular art form, say dancing, will have different motions, and these different motions would be noticed by human beings at different levels. Some might observe very facile level of certain dance movements. Other might very deeply observe these dance motions. And at the same time, you can take up the example of a song, the melody of a song, or the combination of various words into it. That might be, some of it would be observed by those who can perceive singing very well and the melody behind it, while others may simply would like to notice its words, its language. So from each of these classes of art forms, from each of these classes of mimetic representation, dance being a mimetic representation, singing being a mimetic representation, all these forms, if you remember, Aristotle again also regarded all these forms as part of poetry, and he used three elements: medium, object, and manner. Medium of imitation, and then object of imitation, and manner of imitation. And in medium of imitation, we put together these all other dance form, all other art forms, for example, dancing, or the flute being played, or any other folk songs, the songs by chorus, all these we included in the medium of imitation. Now, here what Shelley says, he says that each of these classes of mimetic representation, it entirely depends upon who is at the receiving end, who is the hearer, and who is the spectator receiving these pure pleasure forms, right? And to each their own. That is, each spectator or hearer is different, and he is receiving these representations differently depending upon his own cognitive skills, depending upon his own experiences, depending upon how he make an understanding out of this entire pleasurable situation. So this sense of approximation, I would regard this particular term, how far this approximates with the reality, or how far imitation fares over the scale. That is called approximation. What is approximation? When two things are nearer, or when you're trying to draw an analogy. This approximates to the river. This particular painting approximates to the real river. So approximation is the degree of closeness. That is, this degree of closeness, how well can you perceive from the original objects? And it will obviously be different for each to each their own, depending upon their perceptions and cognitive and other faculties of mind, their own experiences. And we took the very basic example of the plus sign. So how close this imitation is to each of the different spectators or viewers who are looking at it, or who are hearing that particular thing, or let's say any other music or song. So Shelley says there are three things. First is, there is definitely some sort of rhythm, some sort of order, some sort of symmetry, some sort of uniformity in these imitations of the natural objects, or in these mimetic representations, or broadly, if we can now term them as in these art forms, for example, dance and singing. Then there is something called observation, that is, the sense of approximation of this symmetry, the sense of the ability to see this sense of closeness to the original objects. That is something very different in each of the human beings, how they perceive it. So this how they perceive it thing, this was, by modern writers, it was regarded as nothing but taste. How you perceive a particular art object. For you, a simple chaos of different colors on a painting board could represent nothing but chaos in itself. But someone who is deeply associated with art, he or she may represent it, or he or she may perceive it quite differently, and he or she may see it as an artistic representation of that chaos in the artist's life. So it is different to each individual how they perceive it, and modern writers, they called it taste. Now, if we read this line in the middle of this paragraph, every man in the infancy of art observes an order which approximates, every man in the infancy of art observes an order and observes a uniformity which approximates more or less closely to that from which this highest delight results. He seeks that approximation, that closeness, which more or less is from that highest delight which results. But the diversity is not sufficiently marked as that its degradation should be sensible. Now, the poet is the one in whom this ability or this quality to see or to perceive this approximation towards approximation of that particular order of piece of art is highest. And that's why he mentions these lines. Those in whom it exists in excess are poets is the most universal in the most universal sense of the word. Now, if you remember, this is also confirming to what Wordsworth's own poetic theory, when he said that poetry is essentially, or the poet is essentially the conveyor, or he exhibits, or he has this expression of hyper acute perceptions. Exactly similar. In the similar manner, in the similar fashion, Shelley here says that the poet is the one who exhibits or who has this sensibility by which he achieves this approximation to the maximum extent as compared to other men. Every man in the infancy of art, I'm quoting from the text now, every man in the infancy of art observes an order which approximates more or less closely to that from which the highest delight results. But because not every man can be a poet, because not every man has this hyper acute sensibilities or these hyper acute perceptions and experiences towards things, only few of them are able to receive or are able to view or able to experience apparently these approximations or the order in these approximations by which they experience some sort of sentimental or ecstatic wonder. And this, of course, ecstatic wonder is sudden when they view that particular nature object. And this is also unique and distinctive to few men of the world. Those few men who exhibit this quality of hypersensitivity or hyperacute, say, hyper or acute sensitivity or perception or experiences towards nature objects. And when he says that the poet has closest approximation with the highest order, he means that the poet has some contact with the order of the highest kind, which in other words can also be called as the ideal state or the ideal order. And because of this apprehension, because of this approximation, he finds things or make things beautiful. Why? Because it is expressed metaphorically and not literally. First of all, here he is not referring to every author initially when the society started to exist and emerge itself as every author to be the one that we see in the conventional sense today. He is somewhere blurring the lines between the prose and the poet. And just as Wordsworth has once dismissed this popular distinction between prose and poet, similarly he says that even Plato and Bacon, although they were writing things in prosaic manner, but they were also poets. They were writing in prose, but they were also poets. And the only condition that was required was anyone who has creatively contributed to the progress of human civilization, be it the author or anyone else, became the poet. Because to be a poet is to understand or apprehend the truth and the beautiful. And the second statement that he makes, that language itself is poetry, or when in its infancy, language itself was poetry. And then later on he says from the text, I am quoting from the text, in the infancy of society, every author was a poet. Every author is necessarily a poet because language itself is poetry, and to be a poet is to apprehend the truth and the beautiful. In a word, the good which exists in the relation subsisting first between existence and perception, and second between perception and expression. First of all, here he is not referring to every author initially when the society started to exist and emerge itself as every author to be the one that we see in the conventional sense today. He is somewhere blurring the lines between the prose and the poet. And just as Wordsworth has once dismissed this popular distinction between prose and poet, similarly he says that even Plato and Bacon, although they were writing things in prosaic manner, but they were also poets. They were writing in prose, but they were also poets. And the only condition that was required was anyone who has creatively contributed to the progress of human civilization, be it the author or anyone else, became the poet. Because to be a poet is to understand or apprehend the truth and the beautiful. And the second statement that he makes, that language itself is poetry, or when in its infancy, language itself was poetry. Here he means that whenever languages originated, that is in its very primitive form, when languages originated, when it was without any grammatical rules, without any major voluminous lexicographies, without any major dictionaries, or all those systems of those semantic and semiotic systems that exist in particular language now. When originally languages emerged, such kind of rules, regulations, and the frameworks of grammar and semantics never existed. It was almost like language was very much rambling. It was chaotic. It was, to an extent, digressive, maybe incoherent, right? So it was used, language was in its very primitive form, it was just to be used as bare minimum way of expressing, or just to fulfill that idea of communication, just to express themselves in the most minimal manner. So first, and how that happened? First, the existence of that any particular object is to be taken into account, and then some perception is attached to it. For example, this object, whether it's circular in nature or whether it is a kind of quadrilateral in its shape or it's rectangle in shape, then you attach certain perception based on this is made up of wooden, and because it is made up of wooden, it might not get affected easily in, say, rains. So this is what the next perception you attach to it. Third, when you try to, now we were using language to express these two things, the description of picking up any particular object and then describing that object. Now, in its very originality, in its primitiveness, when languages were used, why they were very much like poetry? Because they were seen as poetry in the most chaotic form. The moment you give expression to that object, that wooden object, and whatever words you select, that is something, its description. And this is here the work of language comes in. But in its originality, every original language was very much nearer to how a chaotic poetry might be. Now, if I quote directly from the text, and we are talking of those times when language was in its primitive stages, when there wasn't any much of that voluminous dictionaries that existed, or large amount of lexicography existed, or maybe some systems of grammar or some system of some frameworks of semantics existed. So this is right before when these rules did not apply to languages, when the language was in its primitive form. It almost resembled to, it was very much like as if some poem, some cyclic poem is in its chaotic form. You're using very few words and you're being very cyclic about it. Repetitively you're using those words about it. Now let's read it from the text. He says, in the infancy of society, every author is necessarily a poet. Every author is necessarily a poet. So he expands this notion of what poetry is and what a poet is and what he means by this expansion. Any creative thing that has added constructively to the human civilization was the part of poetry, was nothing but poetry. And all these artists who have contributed to the civil life or who have contributed to the evolvement of this human civilization, whether architects, painting, the painters, the artists, the musician, the sculptor, the dancer, the philosopher, all these men were somewhere author, right? Because they were creatively contributing. So he has actually expanded, enlarged the horizons of what constituted poetry. And this is somewhere one of the reasons. The other reasons we'll discuss later on when we are going to have our readings. This is one of the reasons why he says poet is a maker of the entire civilization. Now let's continue with the reading. Language itself is poetry. In the infancy of society, every author is necessarily a poet because language itself is poetry. And to be a poet is to apprehend the truth and the beautiful. In a word, which subsists or which consists of first between some relation between existence and perception, that is the object which exists, and the fact that you're able to perceive that object, you're able to make a perception of that object. First is this, and second relation between perception and expression. Once you've perceived that particular object, how are you able to express it? Through some language expression, and that expression was the form of the part of language. So every original language is near to its source, or every original language near to its source is in itself very much like the chaos of a cyclic poem. There never existed the copiousness of lexicography and the distinctions of grammar, which were the works of a later age and are merely the catalogue and the form of creation of poetry. And they were these expansion of words, these metrical rules or whatever things that started to emerge. If you remember, the same very similar point was made by Aristotle as well. He said the poetic form, the various poetic forms that emerge or subset of that particular genre called poetry, they emerge out of the compulsions of the times, and The various subset of the same genre of poetry, for example, the variations in metrical technicalities, or the variations in how a poem should be written, following meter or not following meter, or the rhymes should be followed or not, whatever rule, certain rule, poetic rules that has been the bedrock of a certain age, poetic age, they emerged out of its demand of the times. They never emerge as if, for this age, let's lay down these number of rules. For this particular age, let's lay down these number of rules. So it was always out of some kind of improvisation that they emerge, or the necessity of the times. Now, exactly in the similar manner, Shelley is conforming to Aristotle's views when he says that, and these later on addition of various words, copiousness of lexicography, and the distinctions of grammar, they were nothing but an addition to the catalogue and form of creation of poetry.